In the mid-14th century, Europe faced an unprecedented catastrophe, the Black Death. This plague decimated the population, reshaping the continent's social and economic landscape. Imagine a world where death is everywhere. Entire towns vanish, and society unravels. This is the story of one of history's deadliest pandemics. But how did this nightmare begin? Where did the Black Death come from? And how did it spread so quickly? Join us as we unravel the origins of this deadly plague and explore its devastating effects on history. Origin of the Black Death. The origins of the Black Death can be traced back to the remote steppes of Central Asia. It is believed that the bacterium Yersinia pestis lived in the fleas that infested rodents, particularly the black rats that thrived in these regions. In the early 1340s, these infected fleas and rats began to migrate along the ancient trade routes, including the famous Silk Road, which connected the East and the West. As merchants and travelers moved goods and animals across vast distances, they inadvertently transported the plague along with them. The bustling trade hubs became the epicenters of infection, where the disease spread rapidly among densely populated urban centers. By 1347, the Black Death had reached the shores of Europe, making its first devastating appearance in the port cities of Italy, such as Genoa and Venice. One of the key factors in the rapid dissemination of the plague was the movement of ships carrying goods from the east to Europe. These ships were often infested with rats, which carried the infected fleas. When the ships docked, the rats disembarked and mingled with the local rodent population, spreading the infection further. The plague quickly made its way from the ports to the inland towns and villages, following the well-worn paths of trade and commerce. The spread of the Black Death was further accelerated by the conditions of the time. Europe in the 14th century was characterized by overcrowded cities, poor sanitation, and a lack of medical knowledge. These factors created a perfect storm for the bacterium to thrive and spread. People lived in close quarters, often with animals, providing ample opportunities for the fleas to find new hosts. Additionally, the lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that measures to contain the outbreak were largely ineffective. By the end of 1347, the plague had established a foothold in Europe, setting the stage for a period of unimaginable suffering and death. The stage was set for the most lethal epidemic in human history, a scourge that would leave an indelible mark on the world. Symptoms and progression of the disease. The Black Death manifested in several horrific forms, each more terrifying than the last. The most common form was the bubonic plague, characterized by the sudden onset of fever, chills, headache, and muscle aches. Within a few days, painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes would appear, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes could grow as large as an apple, turning black and suppurating as the infection spread. It is from these dark, swollen lumps that the disease gets its ominous name. As the bubonic plague progressed, victims often experienced nausea, vomiting, and a general sense of malaise. The high fever and intense pain frequently led to delirium and a sense of impending doom. Without treatment, which was virtually non-existent at the time, death usually followed within a week. The second form of the disease was the pneumonic plague, which was even more deadly. This form attacked the lungs, causing severe respiratory symptoms such as coughing, bloody sputum, and difficulty breathing. Pneumonic plague was highly contagious, spreading through droplets in the air when an infected person coughed or sneezed. This made it particularly dangerous in crowded urban areas. Victims of pneumonic plague often died within 2 days of showing symptoms, making it one of the most lethal diseases known to humanity. The third and most rare form was the septicemic plague, which occurred when the infection spread to the bloodstream. This form of the plague caused severe systemic symptoms, including high fever, chills, abdominal pain, and shock. The skin would often turn a dark purple or black due to disseminated intravascular coagulation, a condition where blood clots form throughout the body. This rapid and devastating form of the plague was almost always fatal, often killing its victims within a day. The rapid progression and high mortality rate of the Black Death left little time for communities to react. People were often struck down within days of first showing symptoms, leading to widespread panic and despair. Medical knowledge at the time was rudimentary, and treatments were largely ineffective. Common remedies included bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and even prayer, but none of these methods could stem the tide of death. The sight of plague victims with blackened, swollen buboes, struggling for breath or succumbing to sudden, violent seizures, was a common and terrifying one. The fear of the disease was so great that it often led to social breakdowns, with families abandoning sick relatives and communities collapsing under the weight of the dead and dying. The Black Death's symptoms and swift progression not only led to unimaginable suffering, but also to a profound sense of helplessness and dread. As the plague swept through Europe, it left a trail of devastation that would alter the course of history forever. Response and reactions of the population. The sudden and devastating onslaught of the Black Death elicited a range of responses from the population, from desperate attempts at treatment to profound psychological and social upheavals. As the plague spread rapidly, communities were often unprepared and overwhelmed, leading to a mixture of panic, superstition, and survival instincts. Initially, people sought to understand the cause of the plague. In a time before the germ theory of disease, explanations varied widely. Many believed the plague was a divine punishment for sins, prompting a surge in religious fervor. Processions, masses, and prayers became commonplace as people sought to appease what they believed to be an angry God. Flagellants, groups of penitents who publicly whipped themselves to atone for humanity's sins, roamed the streets, hoping their extreme acts of penance might halt the plague's advance. Others looked for more earthly explanations. The alignment of planets, earthquakes, and corrupted air were all suspected causes. As fear and desperation grew, so did the scapegoating. Jewish communities, in particular, were blamed for poisoning wells or spreading the disease deliberately. This led to widespread persecution, massacres, and forced expulsions, adding another layer of tragedy to the already horrific events. On a practical level, cities and towns attempted various measures to control the spread of the disease. Quarantine, a term that originated during this period, was one of the earliest public health responses. Ships arriving at ports were isolated for 40 days to ensure they were free of infection. Infected households were often sealed off, with guards ensuring no one entered or left. While these measures had some success in slowing the spread, they were often too little, too late. The response from the medical community, limited by the knowledge and practices of the time, was largely ineffective. Physicians wore beaked masks filled with aromatic substances, believing these would protect them from the miasma, or bad air, thought to carry the disease. Treatments included bloodletting, burning herbs, and applying poultices, none of which had any real effect on the plague. The sheer scale of the epidemic meant that medical practitioners were quickly overwhelmed, and many themselves fell victim to the disease. Socially, the plague had a profound impact on the structure and behavior of communities. The fear of contagion led to social distancing on an extreme scale. Families often abandoned sick members, and the dead were left unburied, their bodies piling up in the streets. Traditional funeral rites were abandoned in many places, as the sheer number of deaths made it impossible to keep up. Economic life was also deeply affected. As workers died in large numbers, farms were left untended, and food shortages became common. Markets and shops closed, leading to disruptions in trade and commerce. The breakdown in social order was palpable, with many turning to looting and lawlessness as societal norms eroded under the pressure of the epidemic. Despite the chaos and despair, there were also instances of remarkable resilience and humanity. Some communities banded together to care for the sick and bury the dead, often at great personal risk. These acts of solidarity and compassion stood in stark contrast to the widespread fear and abandonment, highlighting the complexity of human responses to such a catastrophic event. The reactions to the Black Death were as varied as they were profound, reflecting the deep psychological and social impact of the pandemic. As Europe grappled with the devastation, the responses of its people revealed both the best and worst of human nature in the face of unimaginable horror. Impact on demography. The demographic impact of the Black Death was staggering, reshaping the population structure of Europe in ways that had far-reaching consequences for centuries to come. With an estimated 25 to 30 million people perishing between 1347 and 1351, the plague reduced Europe's population by approximately 1/3 to 1/2. This massive loss of life created a demographic void that had immediate and long-term effects on society. In the short term, the most visible impact was the sheer number of deaths. Towns and villages were often left desolate as entire communities were wiped out. In some areas, the mortality rate was as high as 60 to 70%. The sight of abandoned houses, overgrown fields, and empty streets became a common one. In many regions, the population decline was so severe that it took generations to recover. The dramatic population reduction had a profound effect on labor markets. With fewer people to work the land and perform essential tasks, labor became a scarce and valuable resource. This scarcity of workers led to significant changes in the economic structure. Landowners, desperate for labor, were forced to offer better wages and working conditions to attract and retain workers. This shift in labor dynamics contributed to the gradual erosion of the feudal system, as peasants and serfs found themselves with more bargaining power and mobility. The demographic upheaval also led to changes in social hierarchies and mobility. With so many people dying, opportunities arose for survivors to improve their social and economic status. Inheritance patterns shifted as wealth and property were redistributed among the fewer surviving heirs. This redistribution of wealth contributed to the rise of a more prosperous middle class in some regions, altering the social fabric of Europe. Urban areas were particularly hard hit by the plague, as the dense population and poor sanitation conditions facilitated the rapid spread of the disease. Cities like Florence, Venice, and London saw mortality rates soar, with some losing up to half of their inhabitants. The decline in urban populations had a ripple effect on trade and commerce, as markets shrank and economic activity slowed. However, the eventual recovery and rebuilding of cities also spurred innovations in public health and urban planning, as communities sought to prevent future outbreaks. The demographic impact of the Black Death was not uniform across Europe. Some regions were more severely affected than others, and the recovery rates varied widely. For instance, regions with better agricultural productivity and more resilient economies rebounded more quickly, while others languished in prolonged economic depression. One of the most profound long-term demographic effects of the Black Death was its influence on population growth and demographics in subsequent centuries. The massive loss of life created a population bottleneck, which, combined with periodic subsequent outbreaks of plague, slowed population growth for generations. This demographic shift influenced patterns of marriage, fertility, and migration, shaping the social and economic landscape of Europe well into the Renaissance and beyond. The Black Death's demographic impact extended beyond the immediate loss of life. It fundamentally altered the population structure, economic systems, and social hierarchies of Europe. The scars left by the plague were deep and lasting, reshaping the continent in ways that set the stage for future developments in European history. Economic consequences. The economic consequences of the Black Death were profound and far-reaching, fundamentally altering the economic landscape of Europe. The dramatic reduction in population caused by the plague had both immediate and long-term impacts on the economy, affecting every sector from agriculture to industry to trade. In the immediate aftermath of the Black Death, the most noticeable economic impact was the sharp decline in the labor force. With so many workers dead, the supply of labor plummeted, leading to a severe labor shortage. This scarcity of workers had several important consequences. First, It drove up wages as landowners and employers competed for the remaining laborers. Peasants and artisans found themselves in a stronger bargaining position, able to demand better pay and conditions. This shift in labor dynamics contributed to the weakening of the feudal system, as serfs and peasants began to negotiate more favorable terms for their work. The agricultural sector was particularly hard hit by the labor shortage. With fewer people to work the fields, large tracts of land went uncultivated, leading to food shortages and a decline in agricultural productivity. Some landowners converted their fields from labor-intensive crops to livestock farming, which required fewer workers. This shift had long-term implications for the rural economy and the diet of the population. The shortage of labor and the increase in wages also had a significant impact on urban industries. Guilds, which controlled various trades and crafts, had to adapt to the new economic reality. Many guilds relaxed their strict regulations to attract new members, leading to an influx of apprentices and journeymen. The increased demand for skilled labor also spurred innovation and technological advancements, as craftsmen sought to improve efficiency and productivity. Trade and commerce were not spared from the economic upheaval. The decline in population reduced the demand for goods and services, leading to a contraction in markets. Many businesses and merchants faced bankruptcy as their customer base dwindled. However, the economic downturn also created opportunities for those who survived. Merchants who could adapt to the changing market conditions often found themselves in a stronger position once the initial crisis had passed. The Black Death also led to significant changes in land ownership and property values. With so many deaths, vast amounts of land and property were left without heirs or were inherited by distant relatives. This led to a redistribution of wealth and property, contributing to the rise of a more affluent middle class. The increased availability of land at lower prices also provided opportunities for peasants and townspeople to acquire property, further eroding the traditional feudal structures. Inflation was another economic consequence of the Black Death. The scarcity of goods and the increase in wages drove up prices, leading to a period of inflation. This inflationary pressure was felt across various sectors, from food and clothing to tools and materials. The combination of higher wages and higher prices created a volatile economic environment, with both challenges and opportunities for those navigating the new landscape. In the long term, the Black Death's economic consequences contributed to significant social and economic transformations. The decline of the feudal system, the rise of a more mobile and prosperous labor force, and the redistribution of wealth all set the stage for the economic developments of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The crisis also prompted changes in public health and urban planning, as communities sought to prevent future outbreaks and create more resilient economic systems. The economic legacy of the Black Death was one of both destruction and transformation. While the immediate impact was devastating, the long-term consequences helped to reshape the European economy, paving the way for future growth and innovation. Impact social and cultural. The Black Death's social and cultural impact was as profound as its demographic and economic consequences. The sheer scale of death and suffering left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of Europe, leading to significant changes in social structures, cultural expressions, and religious beliefs. Socially, the Black Death accelerated the breakdown of the feudal system. The drastic reduction in population meant that the rigid social hierarchies of the medieval period were increasingly unsustainable. With fewer peasants available to work the land, those who survived found themselves in a stronger bargaining position, able to demand better wages and living conditions. This newfound social mobility allowed many to escape the constraints of serfdom and pursue opportunities in towns and cities, contributing to the rise of a more mobile and dynamic society. The traditional roles and expectations within families and communities were also disrupted. The loss of so many lives meant that many households were left without a male head, leading to increased responsibilities and, in some cases, improved status for women. Widows often took on the management of family estates or businesses, and their greater involvement in economic and social affairs gradually shifted perceptions about women's roles in society. Culturally, the Black Death had a profound impact on art, literature, and religious practices. The pervasive presence of death and the constant threat of the plague led to a heightened preoccupation with mortality and the afterlife. This was reflected in the art and literature of the period, which often depicted macabre themes and motifs. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic and literary theme, illustrating the universality of death and the futility of earthly wealth and power. Paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts from this time frequently featured grim images of skeletons and the dead, serving as stark reminders of the fragility of life. Religious responses to the Black Death were varied and complex. On one hand, the plague led to a deepening of faith for many, who saw the epidemic as divine punishment for humanity's sins. This belief spurred a surge in religious devotion, with increased attendance at churches, more frequent participation in sacraments, and the erection of numerous religious monuments and shrines. Pilgrimages became more common as people sought to seek divine favor and protection. On the other hand, the Black Death also led to disillusionment with the church. The clergy, who were supposed to provide spiritual guidance and comfort, were often as helpless and vulnerable as the lay people. Many priests and monks succumbed to the plague, and the church's inability to provide effective remedies or explanations led some to question its authority and relevance. This erosion of faith in the church's institutions set the stage for future religious upheavals, including the Reformation. The psychological impact of the Black Death cannot be overstated. The constant presence of death and the breakdown of social norms created an atmosphere of fear, anxiety, and existential dread. People grappled with the meaning of life and the apparent randomness of suffering. These psychological scars influenced cultural expressions, fostering a sense of pessimism and fatalism that would resonate through European thought for generations. Despite the overwhelming darkness of the period, there were also glimmers of resilience and hope. Communities that survived the initial onslaught of the plague often developed stronger bonds and a renewed sense of solidarity. The shared experience of suffering and loss created a sense of collective identity and purpose, prompting efforts to rebuild and improve societal structures. Innovations in public health, urban planning, and medical practices emerged as societies sought to prevent future outbreaks and mitigate the impact of similar catastrophes. The social and cultural impact of the Black Death was multifaceted and profound, reshaping the fabric of European society in enduring ways. The legacy of the plague extended far beyond the immediate devastation, influencing social norms, cultural expressions, and religious beliefs for centuries to come. Legacy of the Black Death. The legacy of the Black Death extends far beyond the immediate devastation it wrought on medieval Europe. Its long-term consequences reshaped societies, economies, and cultures, leaving an indelible mark on the course of human history. The profound changes initiated by the plague influenced subsequent developments in public health, medicine, social structures, and even the intellectual landscape of Europe. One of the most significant legacies of the Black Death was its impact on public health and medical practices. The sheer scale of the pandemic and the failure of contemporary medical knowledge to cope with it prompted a re-evaluation of health practices and the development of more systematic approaches to disease prevention and treatment. This period saw the establishment of quarantine measures and the creation of public health boards to monitor and control the spread of disease. These early public health initiatives laid the groundwork for modern epidemiology and infectious disease management. The Black Death also spurred advances in medical science. The limitations of medieval medicine in addressing the plague led to a growing interest in scientific inquiry and empirical observation. This shift contributed to the gradual decline of medieval scholasticism and the rise of Renaissance humanism, which emphasized observation, experimentation, and the study of nature. The intellectual curiosity sparked by the need to understand and combat the plague played a role in the broader scientific revolution that would transform Europe in the following centuries. Socially, the Black Death's impact on the labor market and feudal system had lasting effects. The dramatic population decline created labor shortages that disrupted traditional feudal relationships and empowered the working class. The increased bargaining power of peasants and artisans led to improved wages and working conditions, fostering a more mobile and dynamic workforce. This shift contributed to the gradual decline of the feudal system and the emergence of a more market-oriented economy. The increased social mobility also facilitated the rise of a more prosperous and influential middle class, which played a key role in the economic and cultural transformations of the Renaissance. Culturally, the Black Death's legacy can be seen in the art, literature, and religious practices of the period. The pervasive themes of death, mortality, and the transience of life that emerged in the wake of the plague continued to influence artistic and literary expressions for generations. The macabre imagery and existential reflections that characterized the period's art and literature resonated deeply with a society that had been profoundly scarred by the experience of the plague. Religiously, the Black Death's impact was twofold. While it led to a resurgence of religious fervor and the construction of numerous religious monuments, it also contributed to a growing disenchantment with the Church's authority. The inability of the clergy to provide effective spiritual or practical remedies during the crisis weakened the Church's moral and institutional authority. This erosion of faith in the Church set the stage for the Reformation, a movement that would fundamentally alter the religious landscape of Europe. The psychological impact of the Black Death also left a lasting legacy. The experience of living through such a devastating pandemic instilled a deep sense of vulnerability and existential uncertainty in the population. This psychological shift influenced cultural attitudes towards life, death, and human existence, fostering a more introspective and contemplative worldview. The reflections on mortality and the human condition that emerged in the wake of the plague contributed to the intellectual and philosophical currents of the Renaissance. Finally, the Black Death's legacy can be seen in the broader historical trajectory of Europe. The societal upheavals and transformations triggered by the plague helped to pave the way for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the eventual rise of the modern world. The profound changes in social structures, economic systems, and intellectual life that followed the plague were instrumental in shaping the course of European history. In conclusion, the Black Death's legacy is multifaceted and enduring. Its impact on public health, medicine, social structures, culture, and religion reverberated through the centuries, influencing the development of modern Europe and leaving a lasting imprint on the collective memory of humanity. The story of the Black Death is not just one of death and destruction, but also of resilience, adaptation, and transformation. What are your thoughts on the legacy of the Black Death? How do you think it has shaped our world today? Share your opinions in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel for more historical explorations, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content. Thank you for watching.